Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, sink deep into the cushions, and let the frantic energy of the day just drift away. We're going to take a very long, very slow, and arguably very financially catastrophic walk through early 18th century London. We're talking about a time when the most brilliant minds in Europe, including Sir Isaac Newton, got completely swept away by the promise of easy money and the allure of a very exotic-sounding trading company. This is the story of the South Sea Bubble of 1720, a moment when a nation decided that a vague promise of future riches was worth more than actual gold, and then watched in horror as it all evaporated. So get comfortable, adjust your blankets, and let's float back to a time when your entire family's fortune could disappear faster than a puff of smoke from a gentleman's pipe. Now, to truly understand the South Sea Bubble, we have to set the stage. It's the year 1711. Great Britain is deep in debt, mostly thanks to decades of expensive wars, especially the War of the Spanish Succession. The national debt is a colossal £9 million, which in today's money would be an absolutely mind-boggling sum. The government is scrambling, trying to figure out how to pay off its creditors, and the public is, well, tired of war and taxes. Into this financial gloom steps a group of ambitious merchants and politicians. They propose a brilliant, or perhaps brilliantly deceptive, scheme. Form a new company, the South Sea Company. This company would be given exclusive trading rights with the Spanish colonies in South America, the South Seas. In exchange for this incredibly lucrative monopoly, the company would take on a large chunk of Britain's national debt. The government would pay the company interest, and the company, presumably, would get fabulously rich trading gold and silver from the Americas. It sounded like a win-win. The public, of course, absolutely ate it up. South America, with its legendary gold mines and untapped resources, was seen as a literal El Dorado. The very name South Sea conjured up images of endless wealth, exotic goods, and a quick path to prosperity. Never mind that Spain, which actually controlled South America, was usually at war with Britain and certainly wasn't keen on letting British ships waltz into their ports and steal all their shiny things. The reality was that the trading monopoly was, at best, incredibly limited, and at worst, almost entirely theoretical. The details like that weren't important when there was money to be made. For the first few years, the company plodded along. The stock price was relatively stable and it paid out its dividends. But then, in 1720, the directors of the South Sea Company decided it was time to unleash the full force of their financial wizardry. They proposed an even grander scheme. They would take over all of Britain's remaining national debt, about £31 million. In return, the government would essentially endorse the company and its stock, giving it an air of unimpeachable security. The public went absolutely wild. This was it. This was the chance to get rich beyond their wildest dreams. The price of South Sea Company shares, which had been around £128 in January 1720, began a relentless, vertical climb. It was like watching a rocket launch, but with more wigs and powdered noses. London went into a state of collective delirium. Everyone, and I mean everyone, wanted in. From the highest lords and ladies of the court to humble shopkeepers and servants, people were pouring every penny they had into South Sea stock. It became a social phenomenon. If you didn't own shares, you were simply not part of the fashionable crowd. You were practically a pariah. The coffee houses of Exchange Alley, the heart of London's financial district, became a frantic marketplace. People shouted, haggled, and wrote out deals on scraps of paper. Messengers ran through the streets carrying news of the latest price surge. Fortunes were being made, or at least appearing to be made, in a matter of hours. A man could wake up a modest gentleman and go to bed a wealthy landowner, all on the strength of a few slips of paper representing ownership in a company that mostly traded, well, on imagination. There are countless stories from this period of servants who became rich overnight only to promptly buy lavish clothes and dismiss their masters, thinking their new wealth was permanent. A story, likely exaggerated but perfectly capturing the spirit of the age, tells of a barber who made a fortune and then shaved his old customers with a silver razor just to remind them of his new status. Because why not double down on the ostentatious display when you're suddenly a paper millionaire? This intense demand for South Sea shares also spawned a secondary market of absolute chaos. Seeing the madness, hundreds of other companies, known as bubble companies, sprang up overnight. These were often completely speculative, sometimes outright fraudulent, and sometimes just brilliantly absurd. There was a company formed for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. The promoter of this company simply opened an office, took hundreds of deposits, and then vanished by the end of the day. Because if you're already trading in theoretical gold mines in a swamp, why not invest in a secret? Other bubble companies included a scheme for importing a number of large jackasses from Spain, or for a wheel for perpetual motion, or even for making salt water fresh. The public, caught up in the frenzy, bought shares in all of them. The logic was simple. If South Sea stock was going up, all stock must go up. It was a beautiful, chaotic ecosystem of collective delusion. And then there's the famous story of Sir Isaac Newton, the brilliant scientist, the man who had literally uncovered the laws of the universe, was initially skeptical of the South Sea Company. He wisely sold his shares, making a tidy profit of £7,000, but as he watched the prices continue to climb, as he saw everyone around him making more and more money, he succumbed to the irresistible pull of the crowd. He invested again, right at the peak of the bubble. "I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies," he reportedly said, "but not the madness of people." Part 2. The Sound of the Pop and the Winter of Despair. So London had reached a fever pitch. In the summer of 1720, the air in the coffee houses was thick with the smell of roasted beans and the scent of unearned wealth. South Sea shares, which had started the year at a modest £128, peaked in August at a staggering £1,050. People were millionaires on paper, planning to buy country estates they had only ever seen from the road. But as we know with any bubble, the more air you pump in, the thinner the skin becomes. And the skin of the South Sea Company was about as thin as a piece of damp parchment. The first pinprick came from the directors of the company themselves. You see, the men running the show, men like Sir John Blunt, weren't exactly blinded by the same delusions as the public. They knew the books. They knew that the exotic trade with the Spanish Americas was virtually non-existent. They realized that the price of the stock had completely detached from reality and was now floating somewhere in the stratosphere. In a move that was as calculated as it was cynical, the directors began to quietly sell off their own shares. They wanted to cash out while the gold was still golden. But in a market built entirely on confidence, secrets have a way of leaking out. When the public noticed that the insiders were heading for the exits, the confidence didn't just crack, it shattered. By September 1720, the panic began. It started as a murmur in Exchange Alley, a few investors trying to sell, then a few more. Within days, the murmur became a roar. Everyone wanted to sell, but nobody wanted to buy. The price of the stock didn't just fall, it plummeted. It dropped from £1,000 to £800, then £400, then £150. By the time the dust settled, the shares were worth less than they had been at the start of the year. The paper millionaires of the summer became the bankrupts of the autumn. Imagine the scene in the London streets. Men who had been bragging about their new carriages just weeks before were now hiding from their creditors. The bubble companies, the ones promising to make salt water fresh or import Spanish jackasses, simply vanished into thin air, their promoters having long since fled with the cash. The hundreds of thousands of pounds that had been invested hadn't just changed hands, they had essentially ceased to exist. The social devastation was absolute. Thousands of families were wiped out. Elderly widows lost their life savings. Young men lost their inheritances. Even the elite weren't spared. Sir Isaac Newton, as we mentioned, lost 20,000 pounds, a sum that would be worth millions today. He spent the rest of his life refusing to allow anyone to even mention the words South Sea in his presence. For him, the universe was predictable, but the human heart was a black hole of irrationality. But the anger didn't just stay in the counting houses, it moved to Parliament. The public was out for blood. They wanted to know how the government could have allowed and even encouraged such a massive fraud. A parliamentary inquiry was launched, and it revealed a level of corruption that made the jackass companies look honest. It turned out that the South Sea directors had bribed dozens of members of parliament and even members of the royal household with fake stock to ensure the scheme was passed. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Aislabie, was found guilty of most notorious, dangerous, and infamous corruption and was ceremoniously hauled off to the Tower of London. He was the fall guy for a system that had collectively lost its mind. In the wake of the crash, the government passed the Bubble Act, which made it illegal to form a joint stock company without a royal charter. It was a classic closing the stable door after the horses bolted move. For the next century, the British public was so traumatized by the events of 1720 that the very idea of a stock market was seen as little more than a sophisticated gambling den. As we leave the cold, quiet offices of the City of London, just feel the weight of the silence. The shouting has stopped. The wind trade has blown itself out. The silver from the South Seas remains in the ground, and the people of London are left to face a very long, very poor winter. So, we've watched the British elite lose their shirts and their wigs in the South Sea crash. But to really understand the flavor of the 1720s, we have to float back across the English Channel. You see, the South Sea bubble wasn't an isolated event. It was the British trying to keep up with the French. While London was obsessing over silver in the South Seas, Paris was drowning in the Mississippi bubble, and at the center of it all was a man named John Law. John Law was a Scottish gambler, a convicted murderer, he'd killed a man in a duel over a woman, and a mathematical genius. He was a man who understood the concept of credit long before most people knew how to spell it. He had a theory that would change the world. He believed that money didn't need to be gold or silver. He believed money could be whatever we all agreed it was, specifically paper. France at the time was in a bit of a state. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, had finally passed away after 72 years on the throne, leaving behind a legacy of magnificent palaces and a mountain of debt so high it was practically its own mountain range. The country was broke. Enter John Law, who promised the regent of France that he could fix everything. He established the Banque Royale, and more importantly, the Mississippi Company. The Mississippi Company was granted a monopoly on trade with the French territories in North America, specifically the Louisiana Territory. Now, at the time, Louisiana was mostly just a vast, humid swamp filled with alligators and mosquitoes, but Law marketed it to the French public as a literal El Dorado. He told stories of mountains made of solid gold and rivers paved with emeralds. He made the swamp sound like a five-star resort where the gold just jumped into your pockets. The French public, desperate for a win, absolutely swallowed it. They began to trade their gold and silver coins for Law's paper money and shares in the Mississippi Company. The demand was so intense that the Rue des Quincampoix, the street where the shares were traded, became a scene of absolute polite madness. People would wait for days just for a chance to buy in. A humpbacked man reportedly made a fortune just by renting out his back as a desk for traders to sign their contracts. Because why not monetize a physical deformity when there's a bubble to be inflated? The share prices didn't just climb, they took flight. In early 1719, a share cost 500 livres. By the end of the year, it was worth 10,000 livres. People became millionaires overnight, a term that was actually coined during this exact craze. Law was hailed as a savior. He was the most powerful man in France, the king of paper. But while the paper wealth was soaring in Paris, the reality in Louisiana was, well, let's just say the mountains of gold were suspiciously flat and muddy. To keep the illusion alive, Law even staged a parade in Paris where he hired thousands of beggars, gave them shiny new shovels, and marched them through the streets, telling everyone they were miners heading off to harvest the Mississippi gold. The miners, of course, never found any gold, and soon the smart money in Paris started to get nervous. A few wealthy investors decided to turn their paper shares back into actual gold coins. When they went to the bank, they realized the horrifying truth. There wasn't enough gold to go around. The bank runs were so violent that people were actually crushed in the crowds outside the treasury. The bubble burst with a sound that could be heard across Europe. The paper money was declared worthless, and John Law, the man who had briefly been the most powerful person in France, had to flee the country in the middle of the night, eventually dying in poverty in Venice. As we leave the quiet, empty halls of the Palais Royal, just feel the weight of the silence. The king of paper has abdicated. The gold has vanished. The swamp in Louisiana remains silent, indifferent to the fortunes that were lost in its name. So we've watched the global markets dissolve into a puddle of paper and broken promises. We've seen men like John Law vanish into the Venetian might, leaving a continent to wonder why they ever thought a swamp was made of gold. But while the commoners were losing their life savings in the streets, the monarchs were dealing with a much more intimate, much more terrifying kind of collapse. We're floating forward now, deep into the Georgian era, to look at a man who is often unfairly remembered as the villain of American history, but who was really just a quiet man trapped in a loud, chaotic body. This is the story of King George III. George III was, in many ways, the un-monarch. He didn't care for the glittering decadence of the French court. He didn't have a string of mistresses or a fleet of golden yachts. He was a man of simple tastes. He loved his wife, Queen Charlotte, so much so that they had 15 children, which is a level of commitment that makes most modern families look like a small hobby group. He loved his books, he loved the sciences, and he loved his farm. They called him Farmer George because he genuinely rather discuss the rotation of turnips with a local peasant than talk about the taxation of tea with his ministers. But in 1788, the order of George's world began to unravel. It started with physical pain, stomach cramps that felt like knives, aching joints, and a strange, dark, almost bluish tint to his urine. Modern doctors, playing a very long-distance game of diagnosis history, suspect he suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder. But to the doctors of the 18th century, it was simply the madness. The mind followed the body. George began to talk. And when I say talk, I mean he unleashed a torrent of words that simply wouldn't stop. He once spoke for 24 hours straight, his voice turning into a ragged, bloody whisper, his mouth foaming. Yet he kept going, greeting people who had been dead for 50 years, knighting oak trees in the forest, and holding long, intense conversations with the ghost of a favorite daughter. For a man who valued dignity and restraint above all else, it was a living, breathing nightmare. The treatments were arguably worse than the disease. The royal physicians, having absolutely no idea what they were doing, decided that the best way to cure a king was to torture him. They applied blistering agents to his legs, caustic chemicals that burn the skin to raise painful welts, believing this would draw out the bad humors. They forced him into a straight waistcoat when he became too agitated. They bled him, they purged him, and they kept him in a dark, cold isolation that would have broken a healthy man. There were periods of lucid intervals where the fog would lift, and George would wake up to find himself in a room he didn't recognize, surrounded by doctors who treated him like a prisoner. The sadness of those moments is almost tactile. He would realize he had missed months of his children's lives, months of his kingdom's business. He would apologize, try to resume his duties, and wait with a growing sense of dread for the shadow to return. By 1810, the shadow stayed for good. Following the death of his beloved daughter Amelia, the king retreated into a world only he could see. He spent his final decade at Windsor Castle, a ghost in a purple robe. He was blind, he was deaf, and he grew a long, white, biblical beard. He would wander through the apartments playing the harpsichord, he loved Handel, and chatting with invisible courtiers, while his son, the Prince Regent, lived a life of such gluttony and excess downstairs that it made the king's madness look like the height of sanity. He died in 2020, having reigned through the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, but having experienced none of the victory. He died in a silence he had built for himself, far away from the wind trade and the politics of men. As we leave the hushed corridors of Windsor, just feel the stillness of the stone. The music has stopped. The farmer king has finally found a field where the turnips grow without effort and the mind is always clear. So, we've watched the farmer king drift away into a world of Handel and white beards, finding a peace that the doctors and their blistering agents could never provide. But while George III was a man suffering from a cruel, random twist of biology, there were other royals who were suffering from a biology that was, well, entirely self-inflicted. We're floating away from the misty fields of England now and heading south across the Pyrenees into the sun-drenched but suffocatingly formal palaces of Spain. We're going to talk about the Habsburgs, a family that decided the best way to keep power in the family was to keep the family entirely within the family. The Habsburgs were the ultimate practitioners of the royal loop. They looked at their family tree and decided it didn't need branches, it just needed to be a very tall, very straight pole. For generations, they married cousins to cousins and uncles to nieces. It was a strategy designed to consolidate land and titles, but nature has a way of charging interest on those kinds of debts. And in the 17th century, that debt finally came due in the form of Charles II of Spain, a man known to history as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Charles was the final result of centuries of inbreeding. To give you an idea of the math, a normal person has 32 unique ancestors in their fifth generation. Charles II had only 10. His inbreeding coefficient was actually higher than that of a child born to two siblings. He was, quite literally, a genetic dead end. The most visible sign of this was the Habsburg jaw. It was a lower jaw so pronounced, so jutting, that Charles couldn't properly close his mouth. His tongue was oversized, leading to constant drooling and making it nearly impossible for him to chew his food or speak clearly. He was a king who was essentially drowning in his own genetics. Because why settle for a normal chin when you can have one that acts as a permanent balcony for your face? Charles didn't walk until he was 8. He was never educated because the court was simply happy if he survived the day. He lived in the Escorial, that vast, cold, granite monastery palace that felt more like a tomb than a home. He spent his days surrounded by priests and exorcists because the Spanish court couldn't accept that their king was the victim of a family tree that was a straight line. They insisted he must be the victim of a curse. They performed endless rituals to unbewitch him. They brought in the relics of saints, they whispered incantations over his bed, and they generally made his life a waking nightmare of religious superstition. Charles, for his part, was a gentle, sad soul who mostly just wanted to be left alone to play with his toys or stare out at the mountains. He was a man trapped in a body that was failing him and a role he was never meant to play. The tragedy reached its peak when it came to the succession. Because Charles was the last male Habsburg, the entire fate of the Spanish Empire, at the time one of the largest on earth, rested on him producing an heir. He was married twice. His first wife, Marie-Louise d'Orléans, was reportedly horrified by his appearance, but grew to feel a deep maternal pity for him. When she died without a child, the court essentially forced a second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, upon him. The pressure was immense. Every time the queen had a stomachache, the bells of Madrid would ring in hope. But Charles was sterile, another gift from his ancestors. He knew it, the doctors knew it, but the political theater had to continue. He spent his final years watching his ministers and the ambassadors of Europe fight over his kingdom as if he were already dead. When Charles finally passed away in 1700, at the age of 38, his autopsy was a document of pure Gothic horror. The doctor famously noted that his body contained not a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. He was a man who had been used up by history before he was even born. As we leave the cold, silent rooms of the Escorial, just feel the weight of those centuries of pride. The gold of the Habsburgs didn't save them. It only ensured that their decline was as slow and public as possible. The jaw has closed, the line has snapped, the empire is being carved up by other men in other rooms. The night
Subscribe
is still.
if you
The
love
ghosts
this
of the
kind of
inbred
immersive
kings have
historical
finally stopped
storytelling.
whispering.
It's not just
Everything
facts, it's
is quiet.
feelings. Drop your current city and time in the comments. I love knowing who's sailing the night seas with me.